They thought this would be just another interview. They were wrong. The air in the studio felt heavier than usual, thick with a tension no one could quite place. Crew members exchanged quick glances, sensing something different about this one. Cameras were in position, lights overhead buzzed softly, but there was an unspoken feeling that something was about to unfold, something that no one had prepared for. Michael, the sharp-tongued journalist known for making his guests squirm, adjusted his sleeves. He had faced politicians, CEOs, and public figures, exposing cracks in their words, unraveling their carefully rehearsed statements. Today would be no different. Or so he thought. Across from him sat Karoline. Still, silent, unshaken. She wasn't like his usual guests. There was no nervous shifting, no darting eyes searching for the right words. She sat as if she had nothing to prove. The countdown began. 3. Michael smirked, already crafting his first strike. 2. Karoline exhaled slowly, her expression unreadable. 1. The cameras blinked to life. Michael leaned in, his voice smooth but laced with challenge. Karoline, you speak so much about faith. You say it's your foundation. But today, he paused, tilting his head slightly. I see no cross, no outward sign of belief. Almost as if it's just something you say. The words landed with precision, designed to provoke. A shift in the air. A moment stretched too long. The crew watched. The world watched. But Karoline? She didn't move. She didn't blink. And in that silence, something far more powerful than words had begun. Michael leaned back slightly, his fingers tracing the edge of his pen. His expression was unreadable, but the hint of a smirk lingered on his lips. He had thrown the first challenge, and now he waited. So, he said, his voice smooth, calculated, you're telling me that faith doesn't need to be seen. His eyes narrowed, watching her closely. That it doesn't matter if there's no symbol, no outward sign. Karoline remained still. No flicker of unease, no shifting in her chair. If his words had any effect, she didn't show it. Faith isn't something you put on display, she said simply, her tone even. It's how you live. A heavy silence followed. The studio lights hummed softly. The tension in the air thickened. Michael tapped his fingers against the desk, nodding slightly as if considering her words. He wasn't convinced. More importantly, he didn't want the audience to be convinced either. He leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. That's an interesting take. But let's be honest, Karoline, people wear symbols for a reason. They show the world what they stand for. He tilted his head. Are you saying that all those people have it wrong? His question hung between them, a direct challenge. Karoline didn't answer immediately. Instead, she let the pause stretch just long enough to make him uncomfortable. I'm saying that what's on the outside doesn't prove what's on the inside, she replied, her voice steady. Michael exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. He wasn't satisfied. So, he continued, his tone shifting to something sharper. If symbols don't matter, why do people rely on them? Why do they find strength in them? Why do they cling to them? His words were quick, pressing. He wanted a reaction. He wanted her to slip, to give him something he could twist. Karoline met his gaze, unwavering. People find strength in different things. But faith isn't about showing, it's about knowing. Michael chuckled under his breath, shaking his head as if he had just heard something amusing. That sounds convenient, he muttered. He let the words sit, watching for any sign of hesitation. When none came, he pressed further. Let me ask you this, he said, voice smooth again. If someone sees you walking down the street, how do they know what you believe? How do they know you stand for anything at all? This time, Karoline tilted her head slightly, studying him. Then she smiled. They don't, she answered. And they don't need to. Michael blinked. He hadn't expected that. You don't think it matters? He asked, feigning disbelief. You don't think it's important for people to recognize what you believe in? Karoline's smile didn't fade. If I need a symbol for them to recognize it, then maybe I'm not living it well enough. Silence. Michael's fingers curled slightly against the table. His jaw tightened just a little. He was losing ground, and he knew it. He glanced toward the camera, as if searching for an unseen ally, then turned back to her. His smirk returned, but this time, it felt forced. "So, what you're saying is, actions speak louder than words." Karoline nodded once. "Exactly." Michael exhaled sharply. "That's a nice thought, Karoline, really. But let's not ignore reality. The world isn't made of people who just take others at their word. People judge. People assume. And if they don't see something, they question if it's even there." Karoline's expression didn't change. "Then maybe that says more about them than it does about me." Michael's lips parted slightly, but no words came. For the first time, it was him sitting in silence. The cameras kept rolling. The weight of the moment settled over the room. The game was shifting. Michael shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening around the pen he had barely used. The silence between them had stretched longer than he intended, and for the first time, he wasn't sure who was leading this conversation. He cleared his throat, forcing a smirk back onto his face. "That's a convenient answer," he said, tilting his head slightly. "But let's be real here, Karoline. People say a lot of things about faith, but their actions don't always match up." He leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. "How do we know you're any different?" The question carried weight. He wanted her to waver, to show even the slightest sign of doubt. Karoline didn't move. She didn't blink. "You don't," she said simply. "And you don't need to." Michael exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head as if he found her response amusing. "That's a pretty risky approach," he remarked. "Expecting people to just take you at your word." Karoline met his gaze without hesitation. "Faith isn't something you have to prove," she said. "It's something you live." Michael's smirk faded just a little. He could feel the control slipping from his hands, but he wasn't about to let it go that easily. He leaned back, crossing his arms. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "Then let's talk about actions." A pause. "You say faith isn't about symbols. It's about what you do." His voice sharpened. "But let's be honest, Karoline. There are plenty of people out there who claim faith but act selfishly. People who wear the title, but their actions tell a different story." He let the words settle, waiting to see if she would flinch. Karoline remained calm. "That happens," she said. Michael raised an eyebrow. "That's all you have to say?" She folded her hands in her lap. "People are human," she continued. "They make mistakes. But faith isn't about perfection. It's about direction." Michael's smirk returned, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Sounds like an excuse," he said. "A way to justify contradictions." Karoline didn't look away. "Or maybe," she said, "it's a reminder that faith isn't measured by what others see, but by what's real." The air in the room felt heavier. Michael felt a flicker of frustration. She wasn't just answering his questions, she was redirecting them. And worse, the audience could see it. He tapped his fingers against the table, considering his next move. He needed to push harder. He tilted his head. "So what happens when someone claims to have faith, but everything they do says otherwise?" Karoline's eyes remained steady. "Then their actions will speak louder than their words," she said. Michael exhaled sharply. "And what about you, Karoline?" He leaned forward. "How do we know your actions are any different?" The moment stretched between them. Karoline smiled, just slightly. "You don't," she repeated. "And again, you don't need to." Michael's smirk vanished completely. The cameras kept rolling. The silence felt suffocating. Michael sat back, arms still crossed. "So that's it?" he asked, his tone flat. "Just take your word for it." Karoline's expression didn't change. "No," she said. "Watch how I live." Michael's jaw tightened. She wasn't giving him what he wanted. No cracks, no hesitation, no defensiveness. And somehow, that made his frustration grow. He tried a different angle. "So you're saying that people don't need to wear their faith?" "I'm saying faith isn't something you wear," she replied. "It's something you carry." Michael ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. He could feel the momentum shifting. Karoline wasn't just answering his questions. She was standing in them, unwavering. And for the first time, Michael didn't know where to go next. The room felt smaller. The tension was thick. The cameras caught everything. Michael had planned to break her composure. Instead, she had broken his. Michael's fingers tightened around his pen, tapping it against the desk in a slow, uneven rhythm. His frustration, once carefully concealed, was beginning to show. He had played this game before, dissecting beliefs, exposing contradictions, forcing people into corners they couldn't escape. But this time, something was different. Karoline wasn't fighting. She wasn't defending. She was just there, unwavering, answering every question without hesitation, without fear. Michael exhaled, shaking his head as if amused. "So," he said, voice sharper now, "you expect people to just believe? Without proof? Without seeing anything for themselves?" The words carried an edge. A final attempt to poke holes in her stance. Karoline tilted her head slightly, considering him. "Faith isn't blind," she said. "It's knowing, even when others don't understand." Michael scoffed, but the usual confidence wasn't there. "That sounds convenient." "It's not," she replied. "It's difficult. Because it means standing firm, even when the world wants you to prove something that can't be measured." The room seemed to grow smaller. The crew, once moving behind the cameras, had stilled. The tension had shifted. Michael forced a smirk. "You say that," he pressed, "but people rely on what they can see. They trust actions, not just words. Isn't that fair?" Karoline nodded. "It is. And actions should match belief." Michael saw his opening. "Exactly." He leaned in. "Then tell me, Karoline, what makes you different from those who claim faith but act selfishly? What proof do we have that you live by what you preach?" A moment passed. Karoline remained still. "You don't," she said. "And you don't need to." Michael's jaw clenched. The same answer, again. But it wasn't dismissive. It wasn't an excuse. It was something else entirely. The control he had at the start was slipping fast. He pressed harder. "So people should just take your word for it?" "No," Karoline replied. "People should look at the way I live." Michael inhaled, frustration creeping into his voice. "That's not enough for most people." She nodded slightly. "That's their choice." His fingers curled into a fist against the desk. The conversation was turning into something he hadn't planned for. She wasn't cracking. She wasn't stumbling. And the worst part? He was the one losing his footing. He let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. "That's not how the world works, Karoline." She didn't respond immediately. Michael leaned forward. "The world judges. It decides what's real based on what it can see. If people don't recognize your faith, how do they know it's even there?" Another silence stretched between them. This time, it was intentional. Then, Karoline's voice came, calm, steady. "If I have to convince them, then they were never looking for faith to begin with." Michael's throat tightened. The response landed heavier than he expected. For a moment, he had nothing to say. The weight of her words settled in the air, pressing against him in a way he hadn't anticipated. Karoline didn't move, didn't shift, didn't blink. She wasn't just answering his questions. She was standing in them. And for the first time since the cameras started rolling, Michael felt like he was the one being tested. The silence grew heavier. The studio lights buzzed. The crew barely breathed. Karoline leaned forward slightly, voice softer but unwavering. "If the world can't see my faith," she said, "that doesn't mean it isn't there." Michael's grip on his pen loosened. His confidence, so unshakable at the beginning, was fading. She wasn't here to argue. She wasn't here to prove anything. She was simply here. And suddenly, Michael wasn't sure if he had been trying to break her faith, or if he had been questioning his own. The interview was slipping from his hands. The audience would see it. The cameras would capture it. And for the first time in his career, Michael had no comeback. Michael's grip on the pen loosened. His fingers, once tapping in steady confidence, now rested motionless against the desk. He had led hundreds of interviews. He had broken politicians, exposed liars, and left countless guests scrambling for words. But this was different. Karoline hadn't raised her voice once. She hadn't dodged his questions. She hadn't tried to win. Yet, somehow, she had taken control. Michael forced a breath, straightened his shoulders. He needed to regain ground. "The world judges actions, Karoline," he said, his voice steady but lacking its earlier sharpness. "If people don't see your faith, how can they believe it's real?" The moment stretched between them. Karoline met his gaze without hesitation. "The world's judgment isn't what defines faith," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It carried through the room, cutting through the air like a quiet storm. Michael swallowed, but his throat felt dry. Karoline leaned forward slightly, speaking with the kind of certainty that left no room for doubt. "If you need to see it to believe it," she said, "then maybe you never believed at all." Silence. A silence heavier than any argument, stronger than any debate. Michael had been searching for a contradiction, an inconsistency, a moment of hesitation. But there was none. He looked away, just for a second. The shift was small, but it was there. For the first time in the interview, he broke eye contact. The cameras captured it. The crew noticed it. He had expected to shake her, but he was the one shaken. Michael's usual composure was slipping, and he knew it. He had pushed her, pressed her, tried to corner her, but she had never once lost control. And now, he was the one searching for an answer. The weight of her words settled over the room, pressing against him in a way he hadn't expected. The silence stretched. The cameras kept rolling. Michael inhaled sharply, shifting in his seat. He needed to say something. Anything. But for the first time in his career, he had nothing left. Michael sat still. His fingers, once fidgeting with the pen, now rested motionless. His usual sharpness had faded, replaced by something quieter, something unsure. Across from him, Karoline remained as she had been from the start, calm, composed, untouched by the weight of his questions. The silence stretched between them, heavy, final. The cameras were still rolling, but the energy in the room had changed. Crew members exchanged glances, sensing the shift. This wasn't just another interview. This wasn't just another debate. Michael exhaled, a slow, measured breath, as if trying to regain control of the moment. But there was nothing left to control. He had pushed. He had pressed. And yet, he was the one left searching for words. The producer stood in the shadows, arms crossed, watching intently. Even he could feel it, the weight of something unexpected. As the final seconds of silence passed, Michael finally moved. He sat back in his chair, nodding once. "I think we're done here," he muttered, though the usual confidence was missing from his voice. Karoline didn't react. She didn't celebrate. She didn't need to. She had never come here to win. She had only come to speak the truth. As she rose from her seat, the producer stepped forward, catching her just before she exited. His voice was lower than usual, careful. "I've seen a lot of interviews," he said, "but this was different." Karoline offered a small smile, but there was no pride in it. Just certainty. "It wasn't about proving anything," she replied. "It was just the truth." With that, she walked away, not in triumph, but in quiet strength. Michael remained seated, staring at the empty space where she had been. He wasn't sure what had just happened. All he knew was that, for the first time in his career, he was the one left with the questions. The screen faded to black. A single thought remained. How do you live your truth when the world wants to define it for you?